Hi everyone, my name is Joel Constable and I work in leadership development as part of Google EDU. And I'm thrilled today to introduce our newest authors at Google speaker, Tim Ferriss. Tim was nominated as one of Fast Company's most innovative business people of 2007 and is the author of the #1 New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Business Week bestseller, The 4-Hour Workweek, which has been translated into 35 different languages. Wired magazine has called Tim the Superman of Silicon Valley for his manipulation of the human body. A few interesting things about Tim. He is actually a tango world record holder and a former national kickboxing champion, which I guess means that he could sweep you off your feet in multiple different ways. Tim is also a guest lecturer at Princeton University and a faculty member at Singularity University based at NASA Ames Research Center. Today, Tim is going to be talking about his new book, The 4-Hour Body, An Uncommon Guide to Rapid Fat Loss, Incredible Sex, and Becoming Superhuman, which is perhaps why all of you are here. As a big fan of both Tim and Becoming Superhuman, I'm really excited to hear what he has to say, so please join me in welcoming Tim Ferriss.
All right, thank you for being here, everyone. I'm excited to be back at the Googleplex yet again. It's all downhill from here after that introduction, so. This is delicious peppermint water. You don't seem to have anything other than flavored water. Okay, so the 4-Hour Body is the topic of a very brief presentation today. I'm going to keep it exceptionally short. I want to get to Q&A as quickly as possible. And I put masochism first in the subtitle because that will be reflected in the video that I'm going to show you. And then I'll add commentary after that, so. I'll explain why I do such things to myself.
This is a biopsy needle.
Just for comparative purposes?
Yep. It's about the thickness, just a little bit thinner than a pencil. So this may seem a little bit strange.
This is in Cape Town, South Africa, where you don't have to sign 100,000 waivers to have such things done to you. That is in the vastus lateralis on the right thigh. I have a nice scar for that.
That's the depth that we've created that tract, so we can get a good sample. Druk hom in.
That is Afrikaans, for those of you who speak Afrikaans here.
I'll say suction. You pull back a bit. If you feel resistance, you just keep it there. And then I'll say release, and then I'll say suction, and then I'll say release.
This is a hollow biopsy tube, and they use the suction to pull muscle tissue, which doesn't have any pain receptors as far as I could tell, into the tube so they can then sever it and use it for analysis.
Relax the leg for me, as far as possible. There we go. You'll just feel that there. All right. And suction. And release. And suction. And release. And suction. Here we go.
All right, who wants to sign up?
See that we got? Just take it off.
How was it?
My muscle samples. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. I'm a little Carpaccio Stark Tartar.
Tim Tartar.
Okay, so these will be used for the enzyme assays, the fiber type,
Yes.
and the comparisons that we talked about with the graphs.
Yes.
And then that one over there will hopefully be used for the contractility and all that goodness.
This is exactly this.
Okay. So there you have it. So I spent 3 years doing that type of thing to myself. Now, why would you do such a thing? Well, as it turns out, that what you would expect to happen based on tests like 23andMe, Navigenics, doesn't always pan out in the real world when you actually look at, for example, muscle fibers under the microscope. So according to a number of genetic tests that I had to look at my genotype, I lack, or I should say I have a nonsense allele for actin 3, and that codes for fast-twitch muscle fiber. So I wanted to see what my potential was for gaining muscle quickly or becoming an Olympic sprinter. The results came back, sorry, you're going to be really, really piss poor at both, but good luck. You have a genetic predisposition, all right? So I had my muscle fibers removed to look at my genetic potential for endurance, and this is what we turn out with. So we're looking, you can see right from the outset, not looking good. And Dr. Cohen, who was one of the two doctors performing the biopsy, came in with the results. And before he described them, he said, I'm going to speak simply because I'm a doctor and I like to speak simply. I was like, all right. He says, you would have trouble finishing a 10K. No, you would have trouble finishing a 5K. I was like, all right. So here are a number of enzymes that limit endurance potential in aerobic capacity, among other things. So you have citrate synthase on the left, which has been studied quite a lot, 3-HAD, and so forth and so on. And you have South African antelope in the red, so I'm not going to be beating them in 40-yard dash or 100-mile races anytime soon. Then you have endurance athletes. And then you have Tim Ferriss, below the line, below zero. I don't know how that's even possible. Turns out that the y-axis here is the enzyme activity percentage of untrained humans. So if that 0 is Homer Simpson, then the green is me, is basically what that means. So there's another graph that I didn't include in this presentation, which is equally instructive, and that was muscle fiber type. Turns out I have very little slow twitch muscle fiber, but I have a lot of what's called type 2A fast twitch muscle fiber, purely through training. All right, so the genotype, what you would expect based on my genetic predisposition, and what I've been able to produce through training are two very, very different realities. And the 4-hour body, the 3-hour body's next. Damn, I already told you guys. The 4-hour body was a 3-year process of testing all of this, whether it was fat loss, endurance, sleep-related, maximal strength-related, to see if the lab results or lab expectations held up under field testing. And it turns out that a lot of it does not hold up. And that I believe you can reach your genetic potential in almost any one of these physical performance areas in about 6 months. And we can talk about some of those examples. One of my inspirations was this girl right here. So Barry Ross, who trained one of his athletes to break all of Marion Jones's records in high school, and his athlete, Allison Felix, ended up becoming the first professional track athlete right out of high school, looks something like this. This is another one of his trainees. And I worked with him for maximal strength development because he's very good at it with sprinters. So he sent me this photograph to illustrate a movement called the torture twist, which is a horrible, horrible movement. I'm happy to show you how to do it after the presentation. This girl is a high school runner. She's 132 pounds, looks pretty normal from all indications, and she deadlifts 405 pounds for repetitions. And that alone was severely emasculating for me and inspired me to train, not harder, but much more intelligently. And I was able to go from being able to pull roughly 315 pounds off the floor to doing rack pulls with about 650 with a double overhand grip that's not a hook grip. So I'll let you guys Google that later, but it's a hell of a lot harder than doing an alternating grip or using wraps. And it was from training using less than 5 minutes of tension per week in the deadlift. The volume was exceptionally, exceptionally low. All right. And that would be one example of the minimum effective dose, which we will come back to. So the guiding tenet for this entire exploration, which started, actually, coincided with beginning to invest in startup companies and advise startup companies. So I'm in Twitter and Evernote and StumbleUpon and others. I wanted to see if you could apply split testing, multivariate testing, that type of data crunching to the physical body. But in general, the tenet came from Mark Twain. So whenever I found myself on the side of the majority, it was time to pause and reflect, not just pause and reflect, but to test the opposite approach. So if everyone's doing 20 to 30 hours of training for Ironman, let's say, well, could you do 4 or 5 hours of training and get better results? Are there any outliers who have been able to achieve that? It turns out there are. So I'm going to keep the presentation based on a number of what I would call first principles that are organizing principles for all of the tactics. So these are more strategies than anything else. Okay. So the means inform the mean. I think I read that incorrectly. The extremes inform the mean, not vice versa. How many people here have seen the movie Objectified? Anyone? Wow, I'm amazed. Only 3 people. Objectified, also done by the director of Helvetica. Fantastic movie. And there's a moment, an anecdote, an interview in that movie that involves garden shears. And Frog Design was being interviewed, or they were explaining how one of their clients came in to ask them to develop a new type of garden shears. And they said, our average user is a 45-year-old woman. She has in this type of job. She behaves this way. And they say, we don't care about your average. We want to know the extremes. So on either side, in each poll, we want to know about, let's say, the 400-pound bodybuilder who can't brush his own teeth, and we want to know about the paraplegic and their limitations. And if you handle the extremes, then you cover the means. It just so happens it doesn't work in the opposite direction. So you've probably heard the joke about Bill Gates walking into a bar and the average net worth jumps to $150 million each. The mean and the average oftentimes mean nothing from a practical standpoint. So on the right-hand side, you have me posing with a number of syringes that have 3-inch needles. And they contain a number of different things. And this is experimenting with the mean, with the extremes rather, to inform the mean. And that particular cocktail is very simple. It's effectively sugar water. It's dextrose, saline, a few other things, perhaps some glucosamine, which I have mixed feelings about, B12, for injury repair. Some of the others are a bit more aggressive. They contain things like stem cell growth factors that I flew in from Israel, IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, some pretty powerful stuff. But what you realize is that when you look at, let's say, how someone who is 400 pounds lost their first 150 pounds of fat, and then you look at how the professional bodybuilder gets from 6 to 4% body fat, you learn a lot more than if you're looking at anything in between those two ranges. So that's the first principle. Look for the outliers and study the outliers. All right, tracking plus loss aversion is more important than how to. So the emphasis in exercise and diet in particular tends to focus on the latest and greatest. And the business model seems to be complicate to profit. So you can't publish a magazine every month without new material. Unfortunately, that leads to a lot of confusion. And what I realized very early on was that the how-to does not matter as much as the motivation for the behavioral change. And spent time with people like BJ Fogg at Stanford University in the Persuasion Lab, among other people, to really drill down into the specifics of this. And this is a photograph of Chad Fowler, before and after, who runs the RailsConf conference, among others. And Chad knew what to do on some level, but he didn't make the change until the pain was painful enough. And I think that for many people, the tracking was the second piece that he used to provide the feedback necessary to compel him to continue. So self-discipline, willpower, all very overrated. If you just use tracking, you can oftentimes catalyze the behavior change that you want to make. And a good example of that would be the flash diet, the so-called flash diet. All that entails is taking an iPhone or a camera phone of some type and taking a picture of every meal before you eat it. It's a pattern interrupt. It makes you aware of your decisions that were previously subconscious or habitual and leads to dramatically more fat loss than even written food journals. And if you were to take that as one option and then personal trainers and a sophisticated, strict zone diet on the other, I would actually bet on the people with the iPhones based on all the data that I've seen. Loss aversion also is very, very important. See, we have, where's Trevor? Trevor, there he is. So Trevor Claiborne here makes a guest appearance in the book as well. And I think accentuates one principle of behavioral change that's very undervalued. In the US in particular, we tend to focus on rewards and patting everybody on the back. In fact, fear of loss, if you look at, let's say, bidding behavior in auctions, people will overbid dramatically more to prevent losing, let's say, $10 as opposed to gaining $10. No big surprise, but you can use that to your advantage. So Trevor in particular bet a coworker, was it $1 a workout? So $1 a workout, if one of them missed their workout, they had to pay the other $1. So in lifestyle impact, $1 does very little, but from a psychological standpoint, it has a tremendous impact. So focusing on tracking, using data to your advantage and that type of feedback to your advantage, and then loss aversion, beat the method. To give you a very clear example of how method can fail, I had a number of CEOs here in Silicon Valley ask me for an index card. They said, I don't want the story, I don't want the details, give me an index card with the bullet points for losing abdominal fat and I'll do it. Okay, and so I gave each of them the index card with the bullet points, success rate 0%. All right, so the reasons for change and the feedback mechanisms are more important in many cases than the actual how-to. Then we have the minimum effective dose. So the minimum effective dose is a way of looking at exercise and diet, among other things, as you would look at medicine or drugs. So what is the minimum effective dose to achieve a very precise quantifiable outcome? Anything above that produces side effects. And the side effects could be from overtraining. They could certainly be from supplementation. They could be from simply trying to maintain a low-calorie diet of 1,200 calories that's unsustainable. All right, so in this particular case, you have two pictures. On the right-hand side, this is a fairly typical meal of mine. I follow a diet called the slow-carb diet, and I could go into great detail about that if you want in the Q&A. The diet, if people ask me the first step that they should take, I'm not going to give them a list of 5 things to change. So if you talk to BJ Fogg, he'll tell you if you ask, let's say, people over 50, if you try to teach them to learn to text in order to lose weight or to quit smoking, it won't work because it's 2 behaviors. So I say change your breakfast, 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. My dad, who ended up losing a total of more than 90 pounds of fat and gaining 20 to 30 pounds of muscle at age 65, began with changing his breakfast, and he went from approximately 5 pounds of fat loss per month to 18.75 pounds in the first month after changing his protein intake within 30 minutes of waking up. That's where I would have people change. Another case study, a female who was running 5 hours per week, 5-6 hours per week, and could not lose the last 10 to 15 pounds, changed her breakfast and lost 3% body fat in between 4 and 5 weeks. Very small change with a disproportionately large outcome. So looking for that minimum effective dose as the starting point. On the left-hand side, you have Tracy. Tracy lost 117 pounds with 2 or 3 10 to 20 minute kettlebell workouts per week, focusing on the 2-handed swing, which you see here, that's the downswing, mother of 2, and it started with that minimum effective dose of very short duration kettlebell workouts, and then she also adopted the same diet. So last but not least, you want to keep improvement relative. So I do not have the Actin 3 to do that, nor do I have perhaps the liver drug tolerance to do that. But the goal is not to be the best in the world necessarily. The goal is to use numbers to be the best you, the best version of yourself you can possibly be in these various domains, these various types of areas of physical performance or appearance. And that's it. Those are the overarching principles that you'll see in every single chapter of the 4-Hour Body, all of the various self-destructive experiments that I perform on myself so other people don't have to. I'm happy to talk about anything related to self-experimentation, the book or otherwise, but that's the end of the presentation. So thank you for listening. Sorry? Oh, yes, we have a microphone. So you can go to the microphone over here, or you can yell it out, and I'll repeat your question.
Hi, Tim. I'm Charles.
Hi, Charles.
I lead design for our mobile products and social products here at Google. Big fan of what you do. It looks like the least Pareto-fied, if that's a word, chapter of your book might be about the endurance stuff. I don't know if that's a fair statement. It seems like you're, based on the antelope graph, your endurance is something you're kind of slow to love, maybe?
Yeah, I'm definitely slow to love endurance.
And so I was just wondering, there's like a bit of a cliffhanger in the book.
Yeah.
How did it come out? And
Okay.
are you going to continue trying to run long distances? That's my question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good question. So there is a cliffhanger in the book with the endurance training. So there are a few things I'd say. The first is that the greatest progress that I've made has been technically related, so biomechanics related, as far as running. Really a combination of pose method and a few other methods. For those people who are really into running, pose method does have its risks. There is a sidebar in the book that discusses how the forces gets transferred from the knee to the ankle. Side note. In my particular case, I hate running. I really, really, really hate running. So I knew that the best way to ensure that I completed an ultra marathon, which will be my first goal. So I've never run a 10K, but I'm going to try to run a 50K minimum, is to do it in front of the entire world while they're watching. So I'm actually going to start that beginning of next month. And I've been making sure that my body is as symmetrically capable as possible before beginning the training to avoid injury. So the prehab chapter is what I've been focusing on thus far. But I'm going to start in earnest next month and maybe I'm not sure if it'll be the quad dipsy, a little too much vertical in the quad dipsy. But I will be starting that in February, and I'm aiming within 6 months to complete, hopefully sooner. I think it could be done in 12 if I really focused on it and didn't have to travel. That's the goal. Thanks. Other questions?
I was curious that I'm generally comfortable with like a liquid diet a lot of times. I can find that I can supplement really almost anything in liquid form, and it's convenient and fast for me. Have you seen any kind of like psychological reports or analysis that follow that? Because a lot of times, obviously, I'm not nearly as satisfied when it comes to liquid diets comparative to finding the same supplements on a plate.
So the question of solid versus liquid food, it's easier to overconsume with liquid. That's part of the reason if people are trying to gain mass. The most controversial topic in the book by far is the mass gain. That's where the meathead brigade has come down upon me in force on the internet. But I gained 34 pounds of muscle in 28 days. I was supervised by a PhD at San Jose State University, and to do that, you have to consume a pretty atrocious number of calories, and the easiest way to do that is through liquid. But as an example, so this morning I was running out and didn't have much time to prepare, so I had unflavored whey protein with some cinnamon and vanilla extract, and then I had Brazil nuts and a handful of different seeds, and that was it. And that will keep me sated because of the protein content for a number of hours. So as long as it has a high protein percentage, I don't see any problem with it. I know people who have lost a tremendous amount of weight using primarily liquid meals and 1 or 2 whole meals per day. But if you have the control to keep an eye on the actual macronutrient and caloric intake, then I don't see a problem with it. Yeah. If people don't want to get up and walk over, that's fine too.
Hi, my name's Peter.
Hi, Peter.
So you showed the woman who lost 117 pounds of fat through changing her breakfast and doing kettlebell swings. So I understand the concept of minimum effective dose to accomplish that goal of fat loss. Did you evaluate whether those same techniques actually were resulting in holistic overall health for her? I understand she lost a lot of fat, but like hormone markers, all kinds of other measures of health, were those improved as well? And is there a minimum effective dose for holistic overall health?
So the question is there a minimum effective dose for for overall holistic health?
Extension of lifespan, that sort of thing. Like, is she going to live longer because of that?
Yeah. So the health is like success in the sense that it's defined differently by different people. So we would have to sit down and actually look at the actual markers. What I would say is that in her particular case, certainly by improving insulin sensitivity and so forth, I would wager that her lifespan would be extended. If you take anything to an extreme with physical performance, like powerlifting, I know a friend of mine's 145 pounds and he can bench press 600 pounds, as an example, or running 100-mile races. He's done that in competition too. I doubt any of that's terribly good for the body long term. But I think that if we're talking about longevity specifically, there are a few takeaways that I'd suggest looking closely at. One would be protein cycling and minimizing complete amino acid profile intake for at least 16 hours a week, which isn't that hard. Things like wheat, lack lysine as an example. Donating blood. Many of the managers of centenarian studies, I think Boston University most notably, this is a male, donates blood because last I checked, men don't menstruate. That's one of the hypotheses as to why women in general live longer than men, is the reduction of toxic iron accumulation, things of that type. But it would really come down to looking at the markers individually, I would say. But if you're looking at, let's just say, the general health markers of, let's say, total cholesterol to HDL, triglyceride, fasting, glucose, hemoglobin A1C, things of that type. In these particular instances, I would wager they've all been improved. For most of the case studies, certainly for myself, I've done thousands of line item blood tests over the last few years. Most of those have been improved longitudinally over time. But if I'm doing an experiment, like I ate nothing but meat and mixed nuts for 21 days to see what effect it would have on those markers, if you remove some of those more extreme experiments, then I would say, for the most part, they're being improved at the same time.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome. If you want to talk about any specific markers afterwards, I'll hang out for a bit. Any other questions? So I was in Nicaragua for this particular test. I was doing some experimentation with medical tourism. I ate grass-fed beef, a few pounds a day, and almonds primarily. Pretty boring diet. My conventionally assessed cholesterol values improved. So my HDL to total cholesterol ratio improved. There were a few things, let me think offhand. It was an improvement on average over my baseline beforehand. And I think that underscores a point that is neglected oftentimes, which is you are what you eat. Yes, that's true, but you are what you ate also, in the sense that I would rather eat grass-fed beef than grain-fed salmon, as an example. So that was to try to highlight the importance of understanding your sources.
Hello.
Hi, nice shirt.
Thank you. I'm wondering what advice or warning you would give to women who are reading your book as far as things that might need to be modified or additional considerations.
So, good question. So things in the book that might be modified for women or emphasized for women. There are a few. The first is that it is extremely important on the slow-carb diet to ensure that you're getting enough calories. So many women who have tried low-carb diets in the past will default to eating, let's say, a chicken breast and leafy salad for lunch. And what you'll find, this is true on any low-calorie or sub-maintenance diet, that you could stop menstruating. It's very, very common among athletes as well, and that's generally not a good thing. So I would say if you eat for fertility, as a woman, you'll generally also get optimal athletic performance and fat loss. A few things related to fertility very quickly. I've seen, this is dozens, I'm not talking about one or two, case studies of women who've just gone from miscarriage to pregnant. And the two most common changes were removing gluten from the diet for a host of reasons that affects hormone regulation. So removing grains effectively. Number two would be increasing saturated fat intake, oddly enough. So I don't know if that's due to long-chain fatty acids. I don't know if it's due to replacing the gluten and therefore increasing protein and fat intake as a side effect, but those were the two most common changes. Otherwise, from a training standpoint and from a dietary standpoint, men and women more or less respond the same way. There is a lot of variability between people, but not as much as we would sometimes like to think. There's been some speculation that because women have a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers, they should train with a higher repetition range in resistance training or weight training. My position on that is that you should train for your desired outcome, not for your current state. Because if I trained for my current state based on my genetics testing, I wouldn't go anywhere. I feel like I would be well suited to, I don't know what sports, sliding down slides or Monopoly. But those would be the highlights. But I would say that women are fortunate on one hand because they have very clear indications of their hormonal state through menstruation and other things, whereas men are just kind of wandering around not knowing what the hell's going on, and then they're like, oh no, my sperm count is 4 times lower than it should be. Uh-oh, didn't realize that until I wanted to have kids. So, side note, the starting point for all of this is comprehensive blood testing. So I would highly, highly recommend once every 3 or 6 months you get comprehensive blood testing done. Certainly everyone here can afford it. And additional testing that I would recommend is SpectraCell, SpectraCell.com, allegedly used by Lance Armstrong and others, which wouldn't mean anything incriminating. It's for nutrient deficiency. I identified that I had a selenium deficiency. How many people here track their selenium? Probably not many. And selenium is very important for spermatogenesis. So I actually did a number of things, fixed my selenium deficiency, used cold exposures, and stopped carrying my cell phone in my pocket, side note, and doubled my sperm count in 3 months. For those of you who are interested in such things.
So, as far as I can tell from the quick look through the book, it pretty much concentrates on what we would normally consider, physical attributes. Do you have any research or anything interesting on minimum effective dose, either for balance and coordination? Because I didn't see much there. And also, mentally, nootropics or diet as opposed to mental.
Yeah, good question. So have I found anything for the minimum effective dose for balance, agility, or mental performance, like nootropics? So I was as an undergrad first a neuroscience major, primarily because I wanted to focus on smart drugs. I've seen a lot. There are many different approaches you can take. As far as balance goes, there's quite a lot of debate in the PT and athletic training community about whether balance is a general skill you can train, just like if there exists a general intelligence. Usually people would segment it out into for example, muscular symmetry. So one of the fastest ways to improve general agility and balance, I would say, is by doing an assessment called the FMS, the Functional Movement Screen, and I'm sure there are people in SF who can do that. And that'll assess imbalances from left to right or contralaterally. And when you fix those, it's pretty astounding. It's in the prehab chapter. But if you identify using, for example, there are two movements called the chop and lift, where you're using, generally speaking, a cable, and you're doing this type chopping diagonal movement, and then you're reversing it and going up. And so you test your 4 quadrants, and you'll generally find that one quadrant is extremely weak, relatively speaking. And when you fix that, it's incredible how many aches and pains, how many problems, how many injuries just disappear. So I would say that from a functional standpoint, that would be one. If we're talking about equilibrium, I haven't found anything to be particularly effective for general balance. For mental performance, this is something that I really debated quite a lot because I'm a huge fan of cognitive enhancement, and I didn't include any chapters specifically on that because I found, looking at the literature, that improving physical performance, what most people would divorce from their mind or brain, is actually the best way to improve cognitive performance. And there's a great book called Spark, which was written by a Harvard MD, that looks at physical education and some very sophisticated programs for improving academic performance, specifically by making students perform at a certain heart rate immediately prior to their worst subjects. Really fascinating stuff. But if we're talking about drugs, I'm sure there are a few people in this audience who probably tried modafinil, among others. So Provigil, which is an anti-narcolepsy drug. There are a lot of drugs that will improve short-term memory, working memory, reaction speed. Vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic hormone that's used in, let's say, bedwetting in children in some cases, also can improve short-term memory. The reason that I have ended up staying away from many of these drugs is that I've realized in the course of doing all this research and all this testing that the brain is a very sensitive instrument, and the brain, the body likes homeostasis. So if you interrupt any of the feedback loops, you can cause some really significant long-term problems. That's certainly true if you look at, let's say, anabolics use. If you're using supraphysiological high-dose, let's just say testosterone cypionate, then you can screw up your HPTA axis, and if you screw up your hypothalamus, boy, you're going to have a lot of issues. So I've ended up staying away from the smart drugs most recently. The exceptions would be yerba mate tea. I love yerba mate, and it contains a handful of stimulants that all have different pharmacokinetics, so you end up getting this nice extended 3 to 4 hour buzz, which is great for writing, among other things. And the other, I would say, for mental performance would be hunger. So when you are in a fasted state, whether that's through intermittent fasting or otherwise, you will experience a heightened level of cognitive function. And I think that does reflect back to from an evolutionary standpoint. If you're hunting and gathering, it's a good idea to have better visual acuity if you're really hungry and you need to find food, among other things. But that's somewhat speculation. Hopefully that helps. Any other questions?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about fruit and why you don't recommend it, and also beans and why you do recommend it. It's probably really slow carb.
Mm-hmm. Are you paleo? Paleo person? Yeah. Semi? Okay. So the question was, why do I recommend against consuming fruit for the most part, and why do I allow beans on the slow carb diet? So the first, fruit as it existed 100, 200 years ago is very different from fruit as it exists today. It's selectively bred and modified to have the highest level of fructose or fruit sugar possible. And fructose is problematic for fat loss specifically. So if you're not trying to lose fat, I have no particular problem with consuming fruit. But if you want to get the best results possible from a fat loss program, fructose is converted to glycerol phosphate, which is then converted to body fat very, very efficiently. It's like there's no more efficient pathway you could find, just about. Same reason that high fructose corn syrup will make you really, really fat. Another note, same reason agave nectar will make you very, very fat. It's 90% concentrated fructose. So looking at, from an evolutionary standpoint, the nutrient necessity of fruit, if you get it once a week, so I have the 1 day off, the cheat day or the binge day, once per week on the slow carb diet, that's more than enough to satisfy any sweet tooth requirement as it relates to fruit. If you absolutely have to have fruit, and I'm experimenting with fruit again in very moderate doses, using primarily berries, because it does have a fascinating effect on blood glucose. It flatlines your blood glucose. So I do recommend fruit on your off day, having it in the beginning of the day, such as grapefruit, which also includes naringenin, which is interesting for extending the half-life of caffeine. But I implanted a Dexcom 7 device in my side. It's a continuous glucose monitor used by type 1 diabetics. And I implanted it in my side to track my blood glucose 24/7 for about 3 weeks. And what I noticed is when you have this small amount of fruit in the morning, it allows you to keep your blood sugar below, I think it's 100 milligrams per deciliter. It allows you to keep it below this critical threshold for fat loss, which is pretty fascinating. But in general, I would say just stay away from fruit, from what I've seen. And I haven't seen any deleterious health effects from that at all. Beans. So beans, if anyone here is a strict paleo eater, beans and legumes are a big no-no. For that same reason, peanuts are a big no-no. And cashews. I love cashews. But if you prepare beans properly, so if you're soaking them, let's say overnight, I simply haven't seen the digestive issues that one would expect based on how strongly they are avoided on the paleo diet. I just haven't seen the problems. So I do recommend lentils and other legumes and beans for the simple reason, among others, that if people are only consuming leafy vegetables or steamed vegetables and protein, they're almost always hypocaloric. And then they get irritable, they get headaches, and they quit. So that would be the main reason. And I'm convinced someday I'll either be proven right or wrong, as I suppose is the case with everything. Lentils, there's some property in lentils that is just it's a force multiplier for fat loss. I cannot figure out, I don't know what it is. I have my speculations, but lentils are amazing. Tastes pretty good too. No problem.
So it's a huge book, lots of sort of distillation of successful experiments. Do you have any stories about things that went wrong, maybe in a spectacular or dangerous way?
Oh, yeah. Somebody asked me recently, you seem to always land on your feet. And I was like, really? And there were two of my doctors were in the audience. I was like, you should ask them how often I land on my head. It's pretty bad. Spectacular or dangerous fashion. Yeah, so I had a PRP injection. So PRP is fascinating. There's some really good researchers here in the Bay Area. Alan Mishra in particular is fantastic. He's at Stanford. PRP stands for platelet-rich plasma. And this is a way of getting around the illegality of anabolics. As a side note, what many athletes will do is they'll have their blood taken out, they'll have a blood draw performed, they'll put that whole blood into a special centrifuge and spin it so it separates out the plasma and white blood cells and growth factors that are associated, and then they re-inject, or they inject that locally into the site of injury. And it works spectacularly well. There are a number of cases of Super Bowl athletes, 8 weeks out, one of them tears an Achilles tendon. Now what? PRP. And then they compete. I've seen world-class sprinters win gold medals at the World Championships, something like 12 weeks after a hamstring or Achilles tendon tears. PRP. I'm sure there are other things being used as well. But I had a number of PRP injections, and most of them worked very well. And then there was one botched injection. And when I say botched injection, it should have been injected laterally on the elbow, and it was injected really right at the point of the elbow where the skin is the thickest. Now, the bad part about thick skin is there's a lot of bacteria. There's always bacteria in skin, but the thicker it is, the more bacteria there is. And they pushed through the bacteria and gave me a MRSA infection, which is a antibiotic-resistant staph infection. And within 48 hours, my elbow is the size of a football. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Harvard-trained doctor. I was eating lunch, and she goes, put down your lunch, get in a taxi, go to the emergency room. And she said, go to this particular emergency room, because she's based around here. And I had to have emergency surgery. I was put on intravenous antibiotics and had to have emergency surgery, because that can not only eat your joint, it can kill you dead. So I would say that was probably one of my more don't try this at home, not recommended to my readers mistake. And I did put that in the book because I don't want people to get trigger happy with injections and things like that can be really serious.
Tell us a little bit about your opinions around the amount of sleep you get. I thought I heard some comment around like 2 hours is good or something, but
So sleep, my opinions on sleep. My opinions on sleep depend on how many sessions of sleep you get per day. So most people in this room will be familiar with what's called monophasic sleep. That's just go to bed, wake up. You get one session of sleep. If you're doing that, or speaking from a personal basis, if I'm doing that, I like to get 9 to 10 hours of sleep. I sleep a lot. If, on the other hand, you're doing what's called polyphasic sleep, where you break it up into multiple segments per day, and that can be taken to an extreme in something called Uberman, which is, I believe, 2.5 hours of total sleep per day, which is comprised of 20-minute naps. Not terribly social, as you can imagine. That can be sustained, and there's a lot of debate about this. There are long articles online about why it's impossible. I can't divulge it yet, but I can say right now I'm using some, along with a few other groups, some pretty sophisticated equipment to demonstrate that it is possible. We're tracking people using EEGs while they sleep on Uberman. So it can be done. Should you do it? That's a separate question. For most people, it's going to be completely untenable and unsustainable. But there are people like Matt Mullenweg, usually called the lead developer or one of the lead developers of WordPress. And while he was working on WordPress, he had his most productive year of coding, probably produced, I'm just speculating here, but 60% of the WordPress code in 1 year, and he was following Uberman. To most people, if you feel like you have to sleep 2 hours a day to get more done, I would say let's look at the time management first before we start cutting you back to 2 hours. But those would be my feelings.
I'm a runner and I like run in the morning, but I don't like to eat right before running. What do you recommend in terms of protein I have to eat out, but also balancing working out?
Yeah. So if you're going to, the question was, I'm a runner. I don't like to eat before I run. How long do you? What's the distance?
Like
6 miles. All right. What I would suggest, if possible, it depends on why you're running. If you're training for a competition, it's one answer. If you're doing it for, let's say, general fitness and fat loss, that'd be another answer. But I would say that if you're consuming a very quickly digested protein, like whey protein isolate, it shouldn't cause too much stomach upset. If you don't want to eat prior to your workout, and you're doing it for training, I would suggest consuming either during the run or after a carbohydrate supplement like Vitargo S2, which is a waxy maize starch, which will help you to replenish your glycogen, particularly if you're following a diet that's paleo or slow carb or something like that. Otherwise, if you want to get extra fat loss out of it, you could just have a double espresso before you go running. But the cold water will also help quite a lot. So if you're doing it for fat loss or body composition or recomposition purposes, 500 milliliters of ice water will do wonders. I kid you not. It's pretty astounding the difference that it makes.
So fat loss is kind of nice because you can have dietary lifestyle interventions and see the results quite quickly and aesthetically. When it comes to cardiovascular health, though, the sort of theory behind what leads to cardiovascular disease is a bit more ambiguous. So I was wondering what your research turned out regarding HDL, LDL, like sort of submarkers for LDL and oxidatic, like sort of how you came across and what conclusions you drew, and also given the fact that sort of evaluating timescales is difficult, right? Dietary intervention taking place on today might have nonlinear conclusions over periods of time.
This is a big question. Very important question. The question, correct me if I get this incorrect. With dietary interventions, or I should say, with body fat loss or muscular gain, it's very easy to see the short-term consequences or outcomes. With something like cardiovascular health or disease, it's quite a bit harder because you can look at the short-term effects, which could be quite divergent from the long-term effects. And what's my opinion or what are my theories on cardiovascular health? So the first I would say, is that cardiovascular is a good word to use. Aerobic is usually co-opted by people trying to sell you something. So like aerobics versus aerobic are very different. You actually get a fantastic aerobic, if we're looking at the pathways, workout after resistance training when your body's trying to clear lactate and so forth. It's actually a fantastic aerobic workout, usually called afterburn, so post-workout oxygen consumption, things like that. As far as cardiovascular health goes, there's no consensus. That's part of the problem. And my position at the moment is that it is important to look at the subfractions of, let's say, LDL or HDL. Berkeley Heart Labs, I believe, does a very comprehensive fractionated analysis. But as with any type of data gathering, the problem is, okay, well, that's fine, but now what do I do? And my suggestion to most people is, if you're getting your fat from good sources, meaning if it's an animal product, the animals are eating the feed they were intended to eat. Or coconut milk, let's say, but not all coconut milk is good for you, and you have to look at your ingredient list. If you're consuming high-quality fats, as long as you're not spiking your insulin levels at the same time by consuming, let's say, carbohydrates, I think it has a minimal negative effect, if any, on cardiovascular, meaning arterial health or blood vessel health. That's my position at the moment. So I've been following this diet for the last 7 years. Not to say that because as an N of 1 it works for me, it'll work for everybody, but looking at the blood tests, again, I'm not a doctor, I don't play one on the internet, but having looked at a lot of blood tests longitudinally, I think as long as you separate the carbohydrates from the protein and fats, for the most part, then you're fine. That's been my experience thus far. But I'm not a cardiologist.
This is kind of a follow-up to that question, which is, are you aware of the published research on successfully reversing heart disease, reversing diabetes, and slowing down the growth of prostate cancer? And I ask because their dietary recommendations are precisely the opposite of what you have in your book, which is the recommendations are to increase whole grains and starches, increase fruit and vegetable consumption, and probably you both would agree on fats. So
I would say I appreciate that. So the first thing is you should be skeptical about everything that I say. I don't want anyone to take my word for anything. And I would say look at the data. So while we're talking about published research, I would also say that not all published research is equal. And in many of I'm not going to name names because there's no purpose to it, but in many of the multivariable tests that show reversal of heart disease, they're also doing yoga, they're also doing therapy, they're also doing exercise, and then they have a diet with grains. And they say, well, told you, it was the diet with grains. And I think that's bad science. So they're not controlling their variables sufficiently in most of the tests. What I would say is if anyone's interested in looking at this topic in depth, read what Gary Taubes has written, meticulously researched, Good Calories, Bad Calories, or Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, which is his most recent book. If you want to look at the role of carbohydrates in endocrine health and also as it relates to disease states. If you have the patience and concentration for it, Good Calories, Bad Calories has probably 100 pages just on the role of carbohydrates in cardiovascular disease and diabetes. I have seen people, I know a mother in particular who reversed type 1 diabetes in 2 of her children, and she did it by eliminating carbohydrates. And in every other attempt up to that point using what most people label as complex carbohydrates, it had precisely the opposite effect. And most recently, I know another woman, one of her children is in ketosis or potentially ketoacidosis. I'm waiting to hear what the doctor's verdict is. And complex carbs, diabetic coma, like that. So I think that based on the data I've seen at least, the safest bet is removing any type of refined carbohydrates or carbohydrates that have been introduced into industrial agriculture in the last 10,000 years. Just my experience.
yeah, I think we agree on refined carbohydrates being bad, but Good Calories, Bad Calories has a lot of omission of key science. For example, he doesn't address the fact that the entire nation of China lives on primarily carbohydrates, and they have a much lower rate of heart disease and diabetes than we have here. He just doesn't deal with that in his book. So if you omit key data, I don't think. Yeah,
I would say that we should invite Gary and you can take him up on it. Gary would be happy to debate. But what I would say is that gluten and rice are very different, number one. Number two, if you look at the disease states as recorded in China, and the data gathering is not very good in China. I'm very familiar with the China study, the monograph, the original monograph, not the book, which I think is largely propaganda. I think that we'll see a lot of changes in China if they're not occurring already. But needless to say, I think it's an area worth a lot of additional research, but just based on everything that I've seen, that I've measured directly and watched, omitting carbohydrates is, and not all carbohydrates, but omitting grains, starches, I have yet to see any negative impact from that.
Yeah, thanks for the response.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the question.
So the event description had a bullet point that said something about 15-minute female orgasms.
I'll give you your $50 bill later. Thank you for bringing that up. I thought we might miss it. Right, so 15-minute female orgasm. Where to begin with this? So this chapter, it's actually 2 chapters, were included at the request of female friends and female readers. The book was originally going to be titled Becoming Superhuman, and it was going to focus on muscular gain and fat loss, and that was it. And what happened was, looking at limiters of muscular hypertrophy, you pretty quickly have to look at testosterone. So I was looking at testosterone, did a number of experiments, tripled my testosterone. That has a number of interesting positive sexual side effects. And so I was talking about this with a number of my friends over dinner, 2 of whom were female, and they were like, what is this, a dude's club? Why aren't you going to write about anything that has to do with female sexuality? Okay. So I looked into it, and I was amazed at how problematic sex is for a very high percentage of women. In terms of, how explicit can I get here? Pretty explicit? In terms of let's just say what most people would consider the involuntary contractions that characterize vaginal orgasm through intercourse. Everybody okay? Okay. Very problematic. Has a lot to do with the distance. Well, I'm not going to even get into it. But anyway, I lost my composure there for a second. So let me give one. But where I'm going with this is, sex is a very sensitive topic in the U.S. I was told by a number of morning shows in the U.S., very popular morning shows, that have had me on as guest before, and we're very happy. We'd love to have you on, but we can't because you have sex in the subtitle. And that, I think, has led to a lot of broken relationships. Sex makes or breaks relationships, makes or breaks marriages, therefore makes or breaks families. I think it's a very important topic. Your choices, if you want to self-educate, are usually, I'm going to go to some fairly strange cult-like environment where it's like worshiping the goddess Noni, which most people don't want to do, or I can deal with this very nebulous sexual advice that's based on a book that's based on a book that's based on a book. There's no testing. So the 15-minute orgasm, I set out to sacrifice myself for science to identify what best practices, what techniques could be used that would have the highest success rate. I'm not going to go too far into this, but for those interested, how can I do this? Let's say this is a clock face. All right, so this is a clock face. And that clock face represents the clitoris if you're looking at it from between the legs. On, I would say, 95+% of women, the most sensitive part is going to be between 1 and 130. Okay? Look on Twitter if you don't think this works. It sounds like some hocus pocus nonsense, and I'll just leave you with that. So, very important topic, and I think that for many people, the sex and the sleep will have the greatest impact on quality of life. So if you have any I'll answer follow-up questions, but unprompted, I don't want to go into all the particulars. Yeah. Oh, one more question? Okay.
So I've been trying to do this low carb diet. Do you have any advice for people who are vegan or doing it?
Yeah. No, okay. So the question was, can you follow the slow carb diet if you're a vegan? The answer is yes. So there are 2 appendices in the book called The Meatless Machine 1 and 2, and I do profile Mark Bozeman, who is a vegan and followed the slow carb diet, and you can move that direction. You will most likely have to supplement with different types of protein. It's challenging. And the reason it's challenging is that you will very often end up including things that I would prefer be avoided, like soy. I think soy milk, isolated soy, is extremely risky as an endocrine disruptor. And if you look at reproductive specialists at different centers, there's one in Edinburgh, his name escapes me at the moment, but he said, until I see data that refutes everything I've seen, I will not feed soy to my children, specifically because of the effect on reproductive health. It can be done. It can be done. And I do have readers who have done it successfully. What I would say is take another look at the meatless machine chapters in the appendices, and then also go to the blog post that catalyzed this entire thing, which is just how to lose 20 pounds in 30 days without exercise on my blog. There are 4,000 comments or 5,000 comments, so just search vegan, and I think you'll probably find a number of suggestions there as well. You're welcome. It's made a lot easier if you do make the allowance to have, let's say, whey protein or cottage cheese or eggs, let's just say, with yolks. It makes a big difference. It's a lot easier. But if you're not willing to do that, which is a personal decision, I would just say to look at the comments as well. Okay, I think that's it, guys. I'll hang out for a little bit longer if people have questions. Thanks for coming.